After my dad died, my stepmother said, "I want the estate, the business, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight. I said, "Give it all to her." Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. My stepmother smiled until her lawyer turned pale when he read the second document, the one nobody had asked about because nobody knew it existed except me and the attorney who drafted it 11 months before my father passed. My father built his business from a single truck and a phone number scrawled on a business card back when I was young enough to ride in the passenger seat during summer deliveries and think of it as an adventure instead of a job. He worked the kind of hours that meant birthdays sometimes happened on a Sunday because that was the only day he had free, and I never once heard him complain about it. He liked what he did. He liked the customers who became friends, the drivers who stayed with him for a decade at a time, the feeling of watching something he'd built with his own hands turn into something that could support other families besides ours. My mother died when I was 19. Cancer. Slow and then suddenly not slow at all. My father grieved in the way men of his generation tend to grieve, which is to say he worked more, not less, and rarely talked about it, and I learned to read his silences instead of asking him to explain them. For 3 years, it was just the two of us, or as much of the two of us as it could be once I moved out and started my own life. We had dinner every Sunday. He'd tell me about the business, ask about mine, and neither of us mentioned my mother much, though I know now that he thought about her every single day. He met my stepmother at an industry dinner, of all places. She worked in logistics for a competitor. Sharp and funny, and from what I could tell in those early years, genuinely good for him. She made him laugh again. She got him to take actual vacations, the first real ones since my mother died. I liked her. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. I liked her enough that when he told me he was going to propose, I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. They married when I was 24. The wedding was small, at his house with maybe 40 people and a backyard full of string lights. I gave a toast about how I hadn't seen him smile like that in years, and I wasn't going to pretend I wasn't grateful for it. She hugged me afterward and told me she'd try to be someone I could count on, not someone trying to replace what I'd lost. For a few years, she was exactly that. The shift was slow enough that I couldn't have told you the exact month it started. It wasn't a single event. It was small things accumulating the way sediment does, invisible until you're standing on solid ground that used to be water. She started referring to the business as ours in conversations where it had always just been his. She'd correct him at dinner about operational decisions she had no real authority over, and he'd let her, because that's what you do when you love someone, and you're trying to make room for them in a life you built before they arrived. I noticed it. I don't think he did. Not for a long time because he wasn't looking for it, and I understand now that not looking for something is its own kind of trust. Around year 5 of the marriage, I started noticing the vacations getting more frequent and considerably more expensive. Not that my father couldn't afford nice vacations. He could. But there's a difference between a man who takes his wife somewhere beautiful twice a year and a household that seems to be perpetually mid-trip, mid-renovation, mid-upgrade, in a way that outpaces even a successful business's actual cash flow. I mentioned it to him once, gently, over Sunday dinner. He waved it off, said she deserved nice things after years of working hard herself before they met, and who was I to tell a happily married man how to spend his own money? He wasn't wrong, exactly. I dropped it. Around year 6 is when the phone calls started changing. He'd usually be relaxed talking to me, easy, the same tone he'd used my whole life. Somewhere in that 6th year, I started hearing him lower his voice mid-conversation if she walked into the room. Nothing dramatic, just a register shift, like a man being careful about which parts of his day he narrated in front of an audience. I asked him about it once. He said she got anxious when he talked business too much at home, said it made her feel excluded and he was trying to be considerate. Fine, reasonable even. I told myself it was reasonable for longer than I probably should have. The business itself kept growing during all of this, which in hindsight made everything easier to hide. 4 warehouses became 5. The fleet nearly doubled. Revenue climbed every year in a way that meant nobody was scrutinizing individual transactions too closely because the top-line numbers all looked healthy. A company that's growing tends to attract less suspicion than one that's stagnant, which I've come to think is one of the more dangerous truths about how people watch money. Growth hides things. Success hides things. Everyone assumes a thriving business is a well-run one, and mostly that's true, right up until it isn't. I didn't have a name for what I was noticing yet. I just had a low, persistent unease. The kind that doesn't announce itself as suspicion so much as a background hum you eventually can't ignore. I started paying closer attention not because I'd decided something was wrong, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something might be, and I'd rather be wrong from vigilance than right from negligence. I didn't know yet what I was watching for. I just knew I'd started watching. The first concrete thing I found wasn't dramatic. It was a beneficiary form. I was at the house helping my father sort through some old files for a business insurance renewal, a task he hated and always put off until the deadline was breathing down his neck. In the process of digging through a drawer for an old policy number, I came across a life insurance beneficiary designation form dated about 8 months earlier that I didn't recognize. My father had held the same life insurance policy since before I was born, with the beneficiary split between me and, after the marriage, updated to include her as well, a perfectly normal and expected arrangement. This form was different. It listed her as the sole beneficiary, 100% 100%, no mention of me at all. I didn't say anything right away. I photographed it quietly and put it back exactly where I found it. I told myself there could be an innocent explanation. Maybe he'd meant to update it and forgot to mention it to me. Maybe it was an old draft that never got submitted. I wanted, badly, for there to be an innocent explanation, because the alternative meant either that my father had deliberately cut me out without telling me, which didn't match the man I knew, or that someone else had arranged this without his full understanding of what he was signing. Neither option felt good to sit with. A few weeks later, I noticed the joint accounts. My father had always kept his personal finances relatively simple. A checking account, a savings account, an investment account he rarely touched, all held individually the way they'd been since before my mother died. Now there was a new joint account, opened about a year into the marriage, that had grown considerably larger than made sense for a simple joint household account. I only found out about it because I was helping him locate a document for his accountant, and he asked me to grab something from a drawer where he kept printed statements, an old habit from a man who'd never fully trusted anything he couldn't hold in his hands. I looked at the statements longer than I needed to. Monthly transfers, moving from an account tied to the business's operating funds into this joint personal account, then from the joint account into what looked like a separate account entirely, one I didn't recognize, and that wasn't in my father's name at all. The amounts weren't enormous individually, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, but they were steady, monthly, and they'd been going on for what looked like over 2 years by the time I found them. I still didn't say anything to him. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was fear of being wrong, of accusing his wife of something and destroying a marriage that had made him genuinely happy, over what might turn out to be a completely reasonable arrangement I simply didn't have full context for. Part of it, if I'm being even more honest, was fear of being right, and having to watch him absorb that his second chance at happiness had been quietly hollowed out from the inside the entire time he thought it was solid. I started keeping my own records, not obsessively, not in a way that consumed my life, but methodically. Every time I visited and had a reason to be near paperwork, I'd note dates, account numbers, anything that seemed relevant. I photographed statements when I could do it without drawing attention. I wasn't trying to build a legal case. I didn't even know yet that I would need one. I think I was mostly trying to build a version of the truth I could trust, independent of whatever story I might eventually be told. The second phone was what finally moved this from suspicion into something closer to certainty. My father kept a phone in the glove box of his truck, which he explained once, unprompted, as a backup device for work calls when his main phone died, which happened more than you'd expect given how often he forgot to charge things. I believed him the first time he mentioned it, because it was a plausible explanation, and I had no reason yet to disbelieve him. I saw him use it once when he thought I wasn't paying attention, while we were loading something into his truck bed at a job site. He glanced at a text, typed a quick reply, and put it back in the glove box before I'd fully registered what I'd seen. It wasn't the phone itself that struck me. It was his face while he read whatever was on the screen, a flicker of something between irritation and resignation that didn't match a routine work text. I didn't confront him about the phone. I didn't confront him about any of it, not yet. What I did instead was start compiling everything I'd found into something coherent. Dates lined up against dates, transfers lined up against the timeline of the marriage, the beneficiary change lined up against roughly when the joint account transfers had accelerated. A pattern was forming, and once I could see the shape of it, I couldn't unsee it. I decided I needed to talk to him. Not accuse him of anything, not yet, because I genuinely didn't know what he did or didn't know about any of this. I needed to understand what he understood before I said a single word that might blow up his marriage over something he may have already been fully aware of and simply hadn't mentioned to me. I called him on a Tuesday and asked if I could come by that weekend, just the two of us, no particular reason given. He said of course, like he always did, and I spent the 4 days between that call and the visit rehearsing a conversation I had no idea how to actually start. He met me on the porch that Saturday with 2 beers already open, which was his way of saying he could tell something was on my mind, because he always did that when he sensed a real conversation coming and wanted to soften the ground for it first. We sat for a while talking about nothing. The business, a driver who'd just retired after 18 years, a warehouse roof that needed replacing before winter. I let the small talk run its course longer than I needed to, because once I said what I'd come to say, there was no taking it back. I told him I'd found some things I didn't understand and I wanted to ask him about them, not because I assumed the worst, but because I couldn't make sense of them on my own. I started with the beneficiary form. I watched his face while I described it, and I saw genuine confusion cross it. Not the practiced confusion of a man caught in something, but the real thing, the look of someone hearing information for the first time. He said he didn't remember signing any new beneficiary form. He said the last time he'd touched that paperwork was years earlier, right after the wedding, when he'd added her as a co-beneficiary alongside me, an arrangement he remembered clearly because he'd specifically asked the agent to keep me on it. I showed him the photo. He stared at it for a long time. Then he asked me quietly where I'd found it, and I told him, and he sat back in his chair like something had physically pressed against his chest. He said he needed to see the original. The joint account was harder for him to explain away, because he did remember opening it, early in the marriage, as a shared household account for exactly the kind of ordinary expenses joint accounts accounts are meant to cover. What he didn't remember, what he insisted he'd never authorized, was the volume of transfers moving through it, or the account on the other end that neither of us recognized. He asked to see everything I had. I gave it to him. I watched a man who prided himself on knowing every number in his business inside and out come face to face with the fact that he'd stopped paying close attention to numbers in his own home, and I have never seen him look smaller than he did in that moment. He didn't get angry, not the way I expected him to. He got quiet and methodical in the exact way he approached a problem at the warehouse, which I think was the only way he knew how to survive being blindsided. He asked me for time, not to confront her yet, not to do anything rash, but time to look at this clearly, without emotion driving the next decision. I told him I understood, and I meant it, though it took everything in me not to push him toward an immediate confrontation. Over the following weeks, he did his own digging, quieter and more thorough than mine had been. Because he had access, I didn't. What he found confirmed everything, and then went further. The account on the other end of those transfers wasn't just receiving household money, it was receiving transfers that originated from business accounts, routed through the joint personal account as an intermediate step, a layer of separation that made the money trail harder to follow unless you were specifically looking for it, which nobody had been, because nobody had reason to suspect his own wife of siphoning from a company that was thriving under everyone's assumption that thriving meant nothing was wrong. He came to me about a month after that first conversation and told me what he wanted to do, not confront her yet and not divorce her, at least not immediately, because he needed to understand the full scope before he did anything that might tip her off and give her time to cover tracks or destroy records. What he wanted instead was to protect the business, protect what he'd spent 26 years building, in a way that wouldn't require an immediate, messy legal battle while he was still trying to figure out how deep this actually went. He'd talked to an estate attorney, a longtime family friend he trusted completely, someone who'd handled the business's legal work for over a decade. Together, they'd worked out a plan. The business itself, the operating company, would be separated structurally from the real estate and equipment beneath it, restructured as a holding entity with its own separate governance, distinct from the operating company's day-to-day control. If in the will the estate and the business were left to her exactly as she might expect or even demand, that inheritance would come bundled with something she wouldn't be looking for, a forensic accounting clause, triggered automatically upon any change of ownership or control, requiring a full independent audit of the company's finances, covering the preceding 5 years before any transfer could be finalized. The clause specified that any findings of undisclosed liability, unauthorized transfer, or fraudulent activity uncovered in that audit would revert operational control of the holding entity to the named contingent beneficiary, me. He explained it to me at his kitchen table, papers spread out between us, in the calm, procedural voice he used when he was walking a new driver through a delivery route for the first time. He said he didn't want revenge. He said he genuinely still loved her, whatever she'd done, and some part of him was holding out hope that there was an explanation that made this less devastating than it looked. But he wasn't willing to bet 26 years of work on that hope. He wanted a structure that would protect what he'd built, regardless of how the marriage resolved, one that would only activate if the worst version of what we suspected turned out to be true. I asked him why he didn't just confront her immediately, freeze the accounts, call a lawyer, and end things cleanly. He said he needed more time to be certain, and more than that, he said something I've thought about many times since. He said if he was wrong, if there was some explanation neither of us had considered, he didn't want to have blown up his marriage over a misunderstanding. And if he was right, he wanted the protection to already be in place before she had any idea it existed, because the moment she knew, she'd start covering her tracks, and the moment for gathering clean evidence would be gone. The paperwork was signed and notarized on a Thursday afternoon in his attorney's office. I was there as a witness. He didn't tell her. Nobody outside that room and the two of us knew it existed. He told me, half joking in the way he did when something was actually deadly serious to him, that he hoped he'd never need it, that he hoped this whole thing would turn out to be some kind of misunderstanding he'd laugh about years later. I hoped that too. I hoped it more than almost anything I'd hoped for in my life up to that point. 11 months after that paperwork was signed, he went into the hospital for a procedure that was supposed to be routine. He didn't come out of it. The procedure itself went fine, or so we were told. It was a complication 2 days later, something to do with his heart that nobody had flagged as a serious risk going in, that took him in the middle of the night with nobody but a nurse in the room. I got the call at 4 in the morning and drove to the hospital, not really believing it, until I was standing in a hallway being told by a doctor I'd never met that there was nothing more they could have done. I won't spend much time on the days immediately after because I don't think I could describe them accurately even now. Grief has a way of collapsing time, of turning a week into something that felt like both an hour and a year simultaneously. I remember fragments, calling relatives, picking out a suit for a funeral I couldn't fully process was actually happening, watching her, my stepmother, move through those same days with what looked to me like genuine grief, and hating myself a little for the small, cold part of my brain that kept watching her carefully anyway, cataloging every reaction, every tear, wondering how much of it was real. I don't know the answer to that, even now. I think grief and guilt can look identical from the outside, and I've decided it isn't my job to adjudicate which one she was feeling in those early days. What I know is what happened afterward, which is its own kind of answer. The funeral was large. My father had built relationships across 3 decades of doing business the right way, and it showed in the number of people who showed up to say some version of the same thing, that he was the kind of man who remembered your kid's name, who paid invoices early instead of late, who gave second chances to drivers other companies had written off. I stood at the front and gave a eulogy I don't fully remember writing, and afterward more people than I could count told me how much he'd meant to them, and I believed every one of them because I'd watched him earn it my entire life. She stood beside me through the service, accepting condolences, and at one point during the reception afterward, I overheard her telling a cluster of his old business associates that she didn't know how she was going to manage without him, that he'd handled so much of the business side and she felt completely lost. It struck me as an odd thing to say, given that she'd never had any operational role in the company at all, not officially, not in any capacity beyond being his wife. I filed it away with everything else I was filing away. About a week after the funeral, she started making comments that told me exactly where her head was, comments that would have sounded like ordinary grief to anyone who hadn't spent the previous several months quietly building a paper trail. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she assumed the business would need someone to step in and provide direction, and that she hoped I understood she intended to be that someone, given that she was, after all, his widow, and widows inherit. I said something non-committal. I was not, at that point, ready to tip my hand about anything. The will reading happened about 3 weeks after the funeral, in the same attorney's office where the restructuring paperwork had been signed 11 months earlier. It was a small room, just her, me, the attorney, and a paralegal taking notes. The attorney read through the will's provisions in the flat, careful tone attorneys use for documents like this, and when he got to the section detailing her inheritance, I watched her posture change, watched her sit up a little straighter, watched something that looked almost like relief cross her face. She would inherit the estate. She would inherit the business, the operating company, entirely, structured exactly as she might have expected or hoped. The attorney didn't read the forensic accounting clause aloud in detail during that meeting, only referencing it as a standard administrative provision related to the transfer of a holding entity, language technical enough that it didn't register as significant to anyone in the room who wasn't already aware of what it actually meant. I was aware. I sat there and said nothing, watching her nod along to a clause that would eventually dismantle everything she thought she'd just secured. After the reading in the parking lot, she hugged me. She told me she knew this must be hard for me, watching everything go to her instead of being split between us the way I might have expected, and she wanted me to know she intended to take care of me regardless, that I'd always have a place in the business if I wanted one, working for her. I thanked her. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that I said it in a voice steady enough that she had no reason to suspect anything. It was around this time that my own lawyer, a friend of the family who'd handled some of my personal matters over the years and had no knowledge of the restructuring my father had done, found out through the grapevine that I wasn't planning to contest anything, that I intended to let the will stand exactly as written without so much as raising a procedural objection. He called me, understandably confused, and asked if I understood what I was giving up. He'd heard rumors, the way people in small professional circles always hear rumors, about odd financial patterns in the business, about her spending habits outpacing anything reasonable, and he thought I at minimum owed it to myself to have an independent look at the books before signing away any claim to a company my father had spent his whole life building. I told him I understood exactly what I was giving up, and exactly what I wasn't. He didn't understand what I meant by that, and I didn't explain it to him, because the entire plan depended on nobody understanding it yet, including the people who genuinely had my best interests at heart. He told me with real concern in his voice that he thought I was making a serious mistake, possibly the kind of mistake grief makes people make, rash decisions born out of not wanting to fight a woman who just lost her husband. I let him believe that. It was easier than the alternative, and it kept the plan exactly where it needed to be, invisible. At the formal hearing to finalize the estate's distribution, a few weeks later, I signed the disclaimer waiving any personal claim to contest the will's terms. My lawyer sat beside me looking like he was watching a man walk voluntarily off a ledge. She sat across the room with her own attorney, and I watched her smile, small and satisfied, the smile of someone who believed a fight she'd been bracing for had simply failed to materialize. She had no idea the fight hadn't been canceled. It had already been decided 11 months earlier in a room she didn't know existed. The forensic accounting clause activated automatically the moment the will's terms were finalized and the transfer of the holding entity began processing. There was no dramatic announcement, no moment where anyone in the room realized what was happening. It functioned exactly the way my father and his attorney had designed it to function, quietly, procedurally, as an unremarkable administrative step buried in language dense enough that nobody without a reason to look closely would think twice about it. She found out about the audit requirement about 2 weeks after the hearing, when the court-appointed accounting firm reached out to schedule initial access to the company's financial records. I wasn't in the room when she got that call, but I heard about her reaction secondhand, through people at the company who described her as confused rather than alarmed, treating it as some kind of bureaucratic formality that would resolve itself quickly. She had no reason yet to think of it as anything else. As far as she knew, this was routine. The audit team was independent and court-appointed, specifically insulated from any influence either she or I could exert over their findings, which had been a specific requirement my father's attorney built into the clause, precisely precisely so that nobody could later claim the process had been rigged in my favor. They were given full access to 5 years of financial records, bank statements, transfer logs, payroll records, vendor contracts, everything that touched the company's money in any capacity. I wasn't involved in the day-to-day of the audit itself. I'd handed over everything I'd personally documented, my own photographs and notes gathered over the better part of a year, to the audit team early on, not as a shortcut to a predetermined conclusion, but as a starting point that could help them know where to look first. What they found once they started looking exceeded even what I'd suspected. The account on the far end of those joint account transfers, the one neither my father nor I had recognized, turned out to be held under a name that took the auditors some effort to trace, structured through a secondary entity that existed primarily on paper. Once they untangled the ownership, it led back to her, through a relative willing to let an account be opened in their name as a favor, apparently without fully understanding, or perhaps without caring, what it would eventually be used for. The pattern the auditors documented went back further than either my father or I had realized. Not just the 2 years of transfers I'd personally tracked, but closer to 4, beginning not long after the joint account itself was first opened, early in the marriage, well before either of us had any reason to be suspicious of anything. What started as relatively modest transfers had accelerated steadily over time, growing in both frequency and size as the years went on, in a way that suggested either increasing confidence that nobody was watching, or increasing need, or both. The auditors were careful, methodical people, the kind who don't editorialize in their findings, who present numbers and dates and let the numbers speak for themselves. But even in the clinical language of their preliminary reports, the picture that emerged was unambiguous. This wasn't a spouse dipping into shared funds for reasonable, if excessive, personal spending. This was a sustained, deliberate diversion of company money, funds that originated from business operating accounts, routed through the joint personal account as a layer of obfuscation, and ultimately landing in an account structured specifically to be difficult to trace back to her. They found expenditures that had nothing to do with household needs or reasonable personal spending, property purchased in another state, held under the same relative's name as the account itself, significant transfers to what appeared to be a personal investment portfolio she'd built independently, entirely funded by money that had never been hers to begin with, none of it declared, none of it taxed, none of it authorized by anyone who actually held signing power over the business's operating accounts, which meant every transfer had required either forged authorization or exploitation of some administrative gap in the company's internal controls, both of which the auditors were now examining in detail. I found out about most of these specific findings the same way everyone eventually would, through the final report, rather than through any special access I might have been assumed to have. My father's attorney kept me updated on general timeline and process when the audit was likely to conclude, what the next procedural steps would be, but he was careful, appropriately so, not to share substantive findings with me ahead of their formal disclosure, because the entire structure only worked if it could withstand scrutiny as a genuinely independent process, rather than something orchestrated behind the scenes to benefit me specifically. During those 4 months, I mostly stayed away from the business itself and from her directly, which wasn't difficult since she'd made it clear after the will reading that she saw my role, if I wanted one, as something she'd graciously offer me, rather than something I had any independent claim to. I went to work at my own job, the modest position I'd built for myself entirely separate from my father's company, specifically because I'd never wanted anyone to say I'd only succeeded because of who my father was. I waited. I checked in periodically with the attorney. I tried, with mixed success, not to let the waiting consume every part of my life the way the suspicion had for the year before it. She, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, spent those same 4 months behaving like a woman who believed she'd already won. She began discussing plans to bring in her own management team at the warehouses. She started making inquiries about selling off 2 of the smaller properties, apparently to fund some renovation to the main house. She hired a decorator. None of this technically violated anything, since as far as the paperwork on file indicated, she was the legitimate owner making legitimate decisions about property that was, on paper, entirely hers. She had no idea that every one of those decisions was being made on top of a foundation the auditors were quietly excavating out from underneath her. The final report was completed and submitted to the court 4 months and 6 days after the audit officially began. A hearing was scheduled to review and certify its findings, a hearing that, under the terms of the original clause, both parties were required to attend along with their respective counsel. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, in a courtroom smaller and less dramatic than television makes these things look, more of a conference room with a judge's bench than anything resembling the theater people imagine. I arrived early with my father's attorney, who by this point had become something closer to family than counsel, given everything the two of us had carried quietly for over a year. She arrived a few minutes later with her attorney, a man I recognized from the original will reading, confident in the particular way of someone who has not yet been given a reason to be otherwise. The report had been submitted to both sides' counsel 48 hours before the hearing, standard procedure to allow time for review before formal proceedings. I don't know exactly when her attorney actually sat down and read it in full. What I know is what I watched happen in that courtroom, which told me everything I needed to know about the answer. The judge opened the hearing by summarizing the procedural history, the original clause, the audit's scope and duration, and asked if either side wished to raise objections to the report's methodology or findings before the court moved to certify it. Her attorney stood. He'd clearly prepared some kind of opening statement, something about the audit's scope being unusually broad, about wanting additional time to review certain transactions in context. He got through perhaps the first third of what he'd planned to say in a voice that started confident and steady. Then he turned a page. I was watching him specifically, not her, not the judge, because I'd been waiting 14 months for this exact moment, and I wanted to see it happen in real time rather than read about it later in a transcript. I watched him get to what must have been page 3 or 4 of the section detailing the specific transfer dates, laid out in a table alongside a second column showing dates from my father's medical records, a cross-reference the auditors had included specifically to illustrate how the pace of transfers had accelerated sharply in the months surrounding his declining health, exactly when someone might have believed there was a shrinking window before oversight tightened. His face changed color. Not a subtle shift, an actual visible drain of color from his face, the kind of physical reaction that happens when a person's understanding of a situation collapses and rebuilds itself in real time. He stopped mid-sentence. He looked down at the page again, as if rereading it might produce a different result. Then he asked the judge for a brief recess before continuing his statement, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been 60 seconds earlier. The judge granted it. During the recess, I watched him step outside the courtroom with her, and though I couldn't hear the conversation, I could read enough of it in the way his hands moved, in the way she went from confused to defensive to something that looked, from a distance, like the exact moment a person's understanding of their own situation finally catches up with the facts everyone else already has. When the hearing resumed, her attorney's opening statement had changed considerably in tone. He no longer argued against the audit scope. Instead, he asked for time to review the full findings before responding substantively, a request the judge granted, setting a follow-up date for formal argument on the report's certification. She turned to me during the break that followed out in the hallway, away from the attorneys. She didn't yell. I'd braced myself for yelling, or the kind of scene that would have made sense given everything at stake, but what I got instead was quieter and somehow harder to sit with. She asked me, in a voice stripped of all the confidence I'd watched her carry for over a year, how long I'd known. I told her exactly as long as he had. She asked what that meant, and I told her the truth, that my father found out before he died, that he built the entire structure specifically because of what he found, that I hadn't done any of this out of some plan I'd cooked up on my own, but had simply followed through on exactly what he'd asked me to protect. I watched something shift in her face when I said that, something that might have been the beginning of understanding that this had never been a fight between us. It had been between her and a dead man who'd seen through her more clearly than either of us realized while he was still alive. Her attorney withdrew from representing her within 2 weeks, citing what his formal notice vaguely described as an irreconcilable conflict regarding case strategy, though anyone reading between the lines understood exactly what that meant. She retained a second attorney, who lasted less than a month before a similar withdrawal. A third attorney eventually agreed to represent her through the remaining proceedings, but by that point, there was very little left to argue. The report carried a judge's procedural weight behind it. The transfer dates were dates. The account ownership was documented and traced. There was no interpretation of the evidence that made the pattern look like anything other than exactly what it was. The follow-up hearing, when it finally happened, lasted less than 20 minutes. The court certified the audit's findings in full. Under the terms of the original clause, operational control of the holding entity reverted to me as the named contingent beneficiary, effective immediately. She retained ownership of the house since the funds used to originally acquire it had been transferred before the documented pattern of diversion began, a detail the auditors had specifically verified rather than assumed. Beyond that, there was very little left standing that the findings hadn't already touched. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom, which surprised me given how long I'd waited for exactly this outcome. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the particular kind that comes after carrying a weight for so long that setting it down doesn't feel like relief so much as the sudden, disorienting absence of something that had become part of how you carried yourself. The business is mine now, structured exactly the way my father intended before any of this started, run out of the same office that still, somehow, smells faintly like the coffee he used to drink there every morning. I kept the same phone number. I kept the same business card design, the same kind he started with over 26 years ago, back when it was just him, a truck, and a number scrawled on a piece of cardstock he handed out to anyone who might need a delivery. Some of the original drivers are still with the company, older now, the way I am, and every so often one of them will mention something about my father, some small memory, and I let myself sit in it for a moment before getting back to the work he taught me how to do.